presentation.
Very good. You're live. Go ahead.
Okay, and so thank you again, everybody, for taking the time on this Friday evening to be together and to talk about this conversation. I wanted to kind of frame up this beginning point in terms of the questions that we'll be exploring together with this presentation, kind of getting grounded in what exactly is climate migration, what's being done about it, how does being welcoming to climate migrants help communities, and really what I'm eager to have a conversation with you all about after the presentation is how can we pool the various assets in Colorado and Northern Colorado and Fort Collins so that we can become a leader on this nascent but very important topic. I sometimes like to start with a personal reflection as you saw as we spoke about this event, we're really looking for an inclusive and compassionate response to climate migration. And so it can be helpful, at least for me, to be kind of garnering my inner empathy by reflecting on how I got to this country and how others may have got to this country. So I'm not going to ask people to answer this unless you're comfortable doing so later in our conversation or in the chat box. But I think it is important to recognize the ways that people arrived into our country, whether Native American, slave, immigrant, or refugee, and what generation that we've been here. So the census from U.S. Census American Community Survey from 2018 is showing that American Indian and Alaska Native is 1%. African American 13.8%, foreign born 13.7%, and refugees 1% in 2018. However, having more than 3 million refugees having resettled in the United States since 1975. So it's also kind of important to think about the number of generations. Like I'm a fourth generation immigrant, and kind of what drove my family here was the potato famine in Ireland. But same census, 2018, first generation Americans 13.7%, second generation 12%, third or higher generation 74%, which means that a quarter of the people in our country are relatively new here. And so I just think this is an important framing as we look towards understanding our solutions and how communities can be welcoming on this topic. Since it's after hours on a Friday night, I thought if you guys would indulge me with a little bit of a personal journey. This is a kind of off resume story about why climate migration for me. As Kevin said, I founded Brenno Group in 1996 and was ready for a sabbatical, but I had this growing sense after working in climate action for over 2 decades that something wasn't quite right. We weren't really getting at some of the systemic hidden threats. And so that's when I started to look into climate migration. And the sabbatical, in fairness, was a balancing act in sort of personal needs and unplugging, leaving town, becoming a learner versus an advisor or consultant, but also coming back with something from that personal experience that could be put into professional practice. So the process included a literature review. I was able to conduct informational interviews with dozens of people working in different disciplines across the globe, really, on this emerging topic from different disciplines. I spent some time in East Africa volunteering in Uganda and Rwanda. The picture in the top center was a highlight, getting to speak to a group of women engineers at the University of Rwanda and on clean energy and career paths in Rwanda around that topic and empowering women and girls. The top left picture was volunteering with Interethnic Health Alliance, and this is their field manager in Uganda. My as you can tell, new and fast friend, Stella Amase, and we were celebrating that night that she'd received her certificate in master's work, and we were working together at a refugee camp in Rhino in the northern part of Uganda. And then it all kind of culminated with the UN Civil Society Conference. Some of you may have been aware of this, came to the United States last year and was hosted in Salt Lake City. And so I kind of compiled with my colleagues the culmination of that 6-month sabbatical into UN Civil Society Conference panel on climate migration and inclusive resilient solutions for host communities. So that's just a little sort of personal journey. The top right, you may recognize as Yvonne Chenard. As I was getting ready to go on my trip, I saw this poster in Patagonia, and it really struck me like, oh my gosh, I'm becoming a brand new beginner. Like sometimes we suffer from the curse of knowledge, and I knew nothing about climate migration, and I had never been to East Africa, and how sometimes putting ourselves in those kinds of situations helps us to understand things differently. And then of course there's the double meaning that climate migration, we're all new once, is a statement to how we might support refugees on this topic. Now, Ari, did you guys lose my screen?
We did. Rich, you are sharing your screen. Please unshare if you could. And Judy, I don't know if you can get back to sharing or not.
Sure, I'll give this a whirl. It does say, yeah, it'll stop others. So yeah, sure.
Yep, we want to do that.
Thank you there, Rich. Sorry about that, but here we are. Cool. All right, are y'all back together?
Yes, yes.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, so that's just sort of a more of a personal journey, and the kind of grounding principles for me though, which is sort of core to Brahma Group, is remaining technically credible in all this, passionate, neutral, and solutions oriented. This kind of work, and as you all know, can, you know, activism and trying to make change can be very exhausting and daunting, and what at least energizes me is collaborative approaches to start working on solutions. I did want to share, if anybody is interested, and again, we'll make this presentation available. There were 4 books that kind of framed my thinking. The first one was the World Watch Institute 2015, Confronting the Hidden Threats of Sustainability. And that was just a really good framing of why climate migration, what it is and why it's a threat to sustainability. The Uninhabitable Earth really was a deeper dive into the severity of this and to really put the magnitude in perspective. Storming the Wall was, to me, sort of the kind of cautionary tale about the path we're on, and kind of an apocalyptic look at, from a homeland security standpoint, what the less than ideal response would be to climate migration surrounding, you know, xenophobia and militarization and other things. And so really I've been setting out in this conversation to try and come up with an antidote to that. You know, when we're seeing these really negative predictions, what can we be doing to offer up alternative pathways? And that's the spirit in which, you know, I'm entering into this conversation with you all tonight. And then the last book, Facilitating the Rights and of Climate Refugees, was just helpful for understanding sort of the legal landscape and why it is so difficult right now, but what is afoot in terms of, on an international stage, trying to provide protections to people that are displaced because of climate change. That's the heavier reading. If you're kind of like travel logs and you would like to kind of get a good chuckle about what happens when an engineer tries her hand at blogging, that was another thing that I did on my sabbatical, was give that a whirl. And so this is the web link for that. And that is just sort of a mix of, you know, yeah, like my personal journey, but also interviews with people and anecdotes and stories, pictures and sort of reflections. And then coming back to that and putting it into practice. Last month, published the Whitepaper, International Climate Migration and What Can U.S. Communities Do? So all of these resources are available to anyone who's interested to dive deeper. And I just wanted to kind of give a high level overview of the methods that I used and some of the resources that spoke to me. Now I'll kind of share some of the knowledge that I gained through that process before then talking through what some of the solutions might be. And I thought one way to deliver this knowledge is through a quiz. I'm not gonna literally quiz you, but I encourage you to think about kind of 5 key takeaways that I think are sort of foundational to work in this space and get your kind of brain thinking about this so that you're interacting with this content a little bit. So I'm going to share kind of 5 takeaways in this quiz, and then we'll dive into how we arrived at these answers. The first is, what would you say the answer to this is, true or false? Many researchers and policymakers are voicing climate migration as the most serious outcome of climate change. You know, is this kind of a big deal, kind of not a big deal when it comes to the impacts of climate change? And as you might expect from some of the books I'll introduce you to, it is true that there is a growing sort of body of alignment that this is a very serious outcome of climate change, if not the most serious outcome of climate change.
Judy, if I could interrupt really quickly, there's an easy way to get feedback if you want, which is have people and participants vote yes or no. So I'll throw that out there if you want to do that, and if you don't, then just keep on going.
I'm always for participant interaction, Kevin, and since you're such a capable facilitator, tech savvy, I say we go for it. So that was question 1. It was a softball pitch and you got to answer in your mind, but now we're going to ask you to answer literally. And what are you going to do? Pop up a poll here for us on true or false?
All I'm going to do is ask people to look at the participant screen, and at the bottom of it, there's a green check for yes and a red X for no. So ask your question and people can just give you a yes or a no. And I'll tell you if you're not seeing that yourself. Maybe that's one too many things to track.
No, I am seeing that. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, so with climate migration, we don't need to worry about climate mitigation anymore. What do you guys think? Yes or no? And of course, climate mitigation is preventing climate change. We'll get into some of these terms in more detail later, but looks like we've had lots of no's, which is the overarching consensus, and we have a bright group tonight, and it is true. Excuse me, it is false that we don't need to worry about this. And in fact, if anything, we need to double down on mitigation, and we'll discuss that more. And we'll also discuss more what's the relationship between mitigation, adaptation, and resiliency, and then climate migration. We get that question a lot, like, well, how do these all relate? Here's like a really interesting one. To me, it's kind of obvious, but when you're stuck in greenhouse gas accounting like I am for 20 years, we get stuck in these ledgers that are very prescriptive around our boundaries. So true or false, each country's economic burden from climate change is proportional to their contribution to climate change. And I'm seeing a bunch of, I don't know if these are the same falses or different falses, but
No, I cleared it. So these are
okay.
New falses. Yeah. Yeah.
New falses. Terrific. Yeah. And of course, this is false as well. It's not just a fair thing where however much you emit is how much you're going to be impacted by it. And in fact, there's a very large disproportional impact between the global North's emissions, the global South's emissions. And like to put this in more stark terms after hours, like when we were little kids and our dad would say, eat all that food on the plate, there are people starving in other parts of the world. And then being a little girl, I would, take that image to heart, and now to become a grown woman and realize that that is also because of our lifestyle that's contributing to climate change and lack access to food, resources, et cetera. That's kind of one way that I think about that. True or false, I kind of gave this one away earlier with the book. Climate refugees are provided international legal, not projections, excuse me, protections. So that's a late night typo there. Climate refugees are provided protections. And we've got good response, accurate response there that, as I said, that is a problem at this point, as we don't have international legal landscapes. And we'll get into that too in some of this material on what the key issues are with that. and what that would mean if we did have legal protections for climate migrants. And then this one's a little nuanced, but I think it's important for a sustainability group like you all, because it's going to challenge us a bit around a few things. So I'll just ask the question, true or false, climate migration leads to increased urbanization? Oh, we got such the high performing group here. That is true. One interesting thing I learned when I was in Nairobi, I was at a workshop with UN Habitat and the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, looking at climate resilience and resettlement design there, bringing some of my background in green building and climate resilience to that discussion. And I learned that Africa is urbanizing 11 times faster than Europe. And 63% of Africa's urban population, including Kenya, lives in slum conditions. So there is sort of this foregone conclusion around urbanization, but are the cities ready? And the other thing is, I kind of have come to challenge that foregone conclusion around urbanization, and we'll get to that later about this relationship between adaptation and resilience. I know that our colleagues at Treeswater People are very interested in this topic too, and I'm not sure if they are on the line tonight. I know that some of them had RSVP'd, but you know, really, how do we also preserve agricultural lifestyles and livelihoods, and this is very important too. So thank you for indulging me in the quiz and interacting with this material. I'm going to kind of then go through these questions a little bit more about what is climate migration, some of the principles here, and then get into some of the solutions. So as we earlier said, yes, World Watch Institute is indicating that this is perhaps the most serious outcome of climate change. And the reason is it's a force multiplier. It's one of these things that's a chronic stressor. It's a negatively reinforcing feedback mechanism that is increasing natural disasters and also conflict, human conflict, wars, etc. And that this scale is quite high. It's estimated at 200 million people. Now, this is a nascent field, so the research has a whole range of estimates of the magnitude. It's actually, obviously, if you can imagine, a difficult thing to measure, because is something indirect or directly related to climate change that is influencing somebody to migrate or not. And so there's just, you know, some research challenges there in measuring this. But we are, as a research body, starting to coalesce around a conservative estimate of 200 million people. Some have higher estimates at 400 to up to even 1 billion people. 3.8 billion people are understood to be climate vulnerable. So when you put that in perspective, that's twice the rate of current migration, and you know, roughly 200 million people. That's roughly, you know, less of the order of magnitude, the population of Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, all combined. It's 25. So anyway, so you get the idea. Now, the other thing is there's these uninhabitable hot zones. So climate models that are predicting cooling person days, which I love as a mechanical engineer. I love this idea of cooling person days of severe, deadly wet bulb temperature. And sometimes we get so wonkish in our profession around temperature rises that the layperson doesn't really understand, like, how big of a deal can it be, a ½ degree Celsius, right? Like, people, you know, lay people don't understand what that means in terms of their experience with the climate. And so putting it in these terms, you know, back to the Wallace Wells book, ½ degree temperature rise is an estimated 150 million additional lives lost. So that's why, you know, it is one of the most serious outcomes of climate change insofar as these uninhabitable hot zones, and really human life is at stake. And whether people migrate, these migration numbers, there's even a worse situation of being a trapped population, where people who are just so vulnerable to climate change that they have the fewest resources and the legal rights to move. So that's sort of the scale and the main issues. I wanted to next move to a couple of things around definitions and terms, and I don't want to necessarily get too bogged down in this, because I kind of started down for perspective. I was really interested in my sabbatical on the international landscape, but most importantly, bringing that back to the United States, in particular, local governments and state governments, to provide some solutions that they could do in sort of urban diplomacy, if you will, in the lack of a federal leadership in this area. And so climate, I don't want to get us too bunged up on climate refugee on the left-hand side, because there are a lot of gradations between the fact that we don't have, you know, somebody being a refugee versus a migrant or an environmentally displaced person, internally displaced persons, et cetera. So let me just explain quickly some of these terms and some of the key issues, and then we'll kind of move past the terminology. So a migrant is somebody who migrates, as it applies, from climate change. They may not be a refugee per se, it might be voluntary, but are migrating due to climate change. Kind of a precursor to climate migration is just this bigger, broader topic of environmentally displaced persons. And that might be people displaced by floods or other hazard events that are environmentally oriented. So you can sort of see like a hierarchy, if you will, of how these things fit together. I really like using internally displaced person because that's people that are migrating within the same country. And in our country, in the United States, it's a little frustrating because so much of the discussion about climate migration is really internal displacement, and it's sea level rise on our seaboards. And I even heard I think it was a New York Times op-ed or somebody this week was even sort of lamenting that the American West is lost in the wildfires in terms of the East not even understanding what that means. And so there's this whole internal displacement that we're grappling with in the United States. I get to that a little bit later too. But then the severity worldwide is even more stark. So I do like this kind of differentiating internal versus like climate migrants. I already mentioned trapped populations, and I also think it's important to introduce the term of host communities, because the way it's working out in Colorado and in the US mostly, we would be more likely to be host communities than migration hotspot. So the key issues, we already discussed this legal framework gap. What I think is interesting about refugees is also kind of interesting about what we're dealing with race in our country right now, which is if you have a legal definition of a refugee, it's implying somebody did something wrong to another person and that there's a culpability there. And then therefore it sets in motion some legal regulations, financial mechanisms, and kind of institutional homes around restoration issues. So therein lies, some of the kind of interesting legal dynamics that come into play. Big picture, what are the areas most affected? The 200 million people, the largest numbers are leaving sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America. We can also talk about island nations that are facing statelessness from sea level rise. Where are they going? If you're using the term refugee, they're living in countries neighboring their country of origin. We also already discussed this whole global South urbanization. Europe is experiencing a lot of migration from Africa, U.S. migration from Central America, et cetera. So just kind of painting the big landscape. And then I was also discussing earlier in the U.S., where are people leaving? For example, Hurricane Harvey, 60,000 migrants, Irma, 7 million people evacuated. These numbers in the US, and so there's, like I said, there's a whole professional body of knowledge and work around internal displacement, largely from sea level rise and hurricanes, and people are leaving and they're not going back. And some of the neighboring host communities are now dealing with significant population growth. Louisiana, for example, their state resiliency plan is incentivizing people to move inland. And they're looking at hospitals and educational systems for people who are trapped, including things like floating, medical facilities. And then of course, southern states to northern latitudes. If you think about climate forecast in Colorado, we're expected to have a climate more akin to Albuquerque, New Mexico by mid-century. So you can, when you think about that, then you can start to realize why people would be migrating to more northern latitudes even in the US. But I wanted to close on one point around who's moving where and why, and global and US, and that is work that colleagues that I met on my sabbatical at Energy Peace Partners out of San Francisco are doing really terrific work. And they started to look at the correlation between climate change and poverty and security, conflict. And from their work, they're noting, as I mentioned earlier, 3.4 billion people are estimated to be highly climate vulnerable. Of the 78 countries highly vulnerable to climate change, 72% rank high also on the Fragile State Index. And as you can see on this slide, 8 out of 10 countries hosting the largest peace operations are located in highly exposed areas to climate change. So it was a really fascinating sabbatical because I feel like I come from a climate, kind of going to this next slide, I come from a climate change profession, but in studying climate migration, I got to interact with people who are more the demographers and the human geography people studying migration and environmental migration. But really it's a lot of humanitarian work and people that are working in the front lines, realizing that climate is really affecting of their work in humanitarian aid and peacekeeping. So that's why it became this transdisciplinary thing. I just highlight some of the topics that became sort of rising to the top at some core issues. I also found the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to be a useful framework or lens in understanding climate migration. It's not like the UN's, it's just a good framework. Like they don't call out one of the goals, tackle climate migration, but when you think about it, goals 1 and 2 on poverty and hunger, climate vulnerable regions are the ones that have these highest poverty. There's serious health issues, but as you all know from reading the news and following this topic, physical risks, mental health risks, emotional traumas, and other things that migrants experience. A lot around, I could just go through all of these, but I'll spare you that. Showing sort of herein lies to me some of the root causes, but also some of the solutions when we think about climate migration from a sustainable development lens. I'm gonna now shift into some discussion about so what's this relationship between mitigation, adaptation, and climate migration? And the best way I've come to describe it is one of prevention. So you may have heard this analogy before in your work in Fort Collins and climate action. For many years, we were all about stopping climate change. So it was the brakes on the car, mitigation. In fact, many of us did not want to start talking about adaptation when it first came on the scene, because it might relieve us of some of that urgency around mitigate, put on the brakes, stop this catastrophe. But then we realized that we weren't changing that curve fast enough. The climate was already changing. We had to adapt, and so that became our airbag system. And so that's where we're now preparing for responding to climate change. Well, now the climate is changing and people are being displaced because of it. And it's too soon to say what the outcome is. I'm just saying we need to have a paradigm of protection, and that right now how we respond to climate migration could cover a whole spectrum, from protection to a just transition that protects all people to there are other writings calling for fears around climate apartheid. And so that's just sort of like a high level way to be thinking about how these are all interrelated. And it gets even more complicated when you think about migration against adaptation. But the bottom line is, it's always best to be proactive in doing something and not doing versus doing nothing. So if you're really successful and have very high adaptation or increased resiliency in these locations, you might be able to keep people in place successfully adapting through various means, or at least if they are having to migrate, it can be in a more thoughtful, managed retreat kind of a paradigm. So the more adaptation, the better the outcome. Doing nothing can lead to some pretty severe things like trapped populations as well as forced displacement. And those are the things we're trying to avoid. So, you know, there's all kinds of considerations like sudden versus slow onset, scale, chronic versus episodic, you know, all these various things. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing to me is being really forward thinking around adaptation and resiliency helps with the migration topic. Earlier we had this quiz and you all got the answer right, but there's some interesting published work on this space. And this is where I feel like there is some room in the US for us to be calling for changes in protocol. You all are Fort Collins Climate Action Network people. So when you think about, there's different climate greenhouse gas accounting protocols, some that look at embodied emissions and more of a production based. But what if we had something that was more of an equity based, that actually looked at the ratio of the burden that we're, the impacts that we're contributing to climate change and the burden we're putting on other people, even if it just starts to open up the mindset of US cities and how we're doing our accounting. I just feel like that at least would be one tangible step that people would start to understand that are we doing enough if we're just responsible for our own emissions or not? So I'll leave you with that question for our discussion later. So now that I've brought you all down on a Friday night, I'm going to try to build you back up again around, well, what is going on? And then what can we do about it together to pool some of our resources? And when I think about what's going on, I organized it by international, national, and local. In a nutshell, I'd say international is nascent but accelerating, and that's working on like policy and legal frameworks, and agencies and are getting together and getting involved in figuring this out, but it's nascent. On the national level, we have all these working parts and pieces, but nothing that has been brought together as a whole. You know, people are doing climate resilience, which is really good, but within their own footprint. Communities are doing climate resilience, but within their own footprint. We have all this internal displacement going on and a lot happening around that. We have immigration and refugee resettlement efforts, sanctuary cities, other things, national security issues. It's like we're looking at it from these four lenses, but we haven't brought that together yet on a national scale into a cohesive whole. And I think everything starts local. And so I'm excited to share with you some of the things going on in Northern Colorado. But let's take a quick look at these other scales briefly. As I mentioned, so to understand the international landscape, it's also kind of piecemeal. These three lenses are not necessarily integrated yet, but the United Nations has their IOM, which is the International Office of Migration. And in 2015, at the request of the member states, they added the Migration, Environment, and Climate Change Division. So for 5 years, there has been, you know, some work in this space. And then in COP21 in Paris, they added Climate Migration Task Force. So there, you know, it's coming into the climate, you know, agreements that they're discussing these things. And then from a humanitarian standpoint, the 2016 New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants really started to put some working definitions and affirming the issues of climate migration and what's needed there. And then last year at UN Climate Week, and the IPCC report was released, and that report did have some of the committees all coming together to be elevating the importance of this topic and basically calling for states to address climate migration, including offering these protection mechanisms for those displaced across international borders. So there's no legal framework, but definitely was called for in the IPCC report last year. And I also already said on the national landscape, we have these like 4 bubbles, like resilience bubbles and internal coastal migration and refugee resettlement, national security. There's some interesting work going on that I'm citing here on domestically focused. But then on the international focus, it is worth kind of noting in 2016, President Obama saw this and in a presidential memorandum spoke to climate change and national security and formally observing the relationship between climate change and migration. So maybe we'll see that again someday coming down the pike from a different administration. We have some things happening. I'm not going to read all these for you, but you get the idea. But we have various things happening in the U.S. Internationally focused. But when it comes to the local landscape, I am also looking at environmental migration. I wanted to give a shout out to Trees, Water People and the terrific work that they do. And you know, we've had a few conversations and are kind of like mutually supportive of each other's work. My work was specifically interested in sub-Saharan Africa, but of course Central America is very, very important, and they're doing really great work there and understanding climate migration and how they can be of service. We have in Northern Colorado, the International Refugee Center of Northern Colorado in Greeley. I have gotten to know the folks there and done some volunteer work there. And I think that could be another regional asset that we try to pull together. Bill, I wanted to give a shout out because you're the one who told me about the Rotary Peace Builders Fellowship. And I think that's wonderful. I bet I haven't had a chance. I kind of lied about my multitasking because I want to get through this presentation, but I see a lot of comments coming in. I bet we can inventory among the 35 of us here tonight, other assets that we could be pooling. The so funny serendipitous thing is CSU SOGIS, which I know and have worked with through all these years, Future Earth, they actually had they were tasked in 2019 with pulling together researchers across the globe, basically, to do a framing document on what the research framework should look like around climate migration. So we actually have right here at CSU some good work happening as well. So that's just kind of a quick landscape. I just want to kind of close on, well, what can we do about this and what's the value proposition? A lot of people, you know, that's what I keep hearing is you can't, you know, bring the information without a pathway for people to understand the value proposition of doing something about it and also giving them some ideas of what to do. And so we can talk about this some more, but it's pretty well documented: community cohesion and inclusivity from an economic health standpoint, community resilience standpoint, neighborhood revitalization standpoint. Duluth, Minnesota and Buffalo, New York are literally branding themselves as climate havens. Economic development, Salt Lake City, they have a really high refugee and immigrant population, have done some amazing work with new businesses, new labor force, innovation. So just some of the examples in value proposition, but what can a community actually do about this? Again, we have to expand and accelerate our mitigation efforts because it's a matter now of life and death, and it's not the lives and deaths of the people in our community, it's the people around the globe, including the global south. We need to include migration in our climate action planning, even as nascent as it is, so that we can start these conversations, include equity principles and how we do greenhouse gas accounting. It might mean that we need study groups. This is hard stuff. I gave you the super easy quiz. It gets harder and harder and harder when we get into like, what do we do about it and how do we manage that? I think there's various things we could build on, like our sister city relationships and other ideas. You know, I think that there's just a lot of maybe misunderstanding, misinformation. I learned a lot during this process. Honestly, I've been in climate action, like I said, for 20 years, but I never really dug much into immigration reform topics, for example. You know, I'm a layperson when it comes to some of these other now colliding areas with respect to climate migration. So it's incumbent on all of us to kind of roll up our sleeves and learn more and understand what climate migrants, how they can actually support our community values and goals. And there is the Mayor's Migration Council. I didn't mention them earlier, but that's a group out of the C40 cities. So there's some work happening at the kind of mayoral level on this topic. I also think sometimes it's easy to be activists and say what the cities should do or the states or the policies, and sometimes kind of leading with heart and walking the talk. I would just say join me if you're interested in continuing to read and follow along on this burgeoning topic and get to know the refugees and immigrants. And I'm speaking for myself, getting to know the refugees and immigrants in my community has been really, really rewarding. And I've learned a lot. Embrace a global mindset when we're doing all of our climate action planning at this little localized level. Know your individual contribution to climate change and really help those communities that are hardest hit. And that, if you want to find me, here's how you can do that. And I guess I'll coordinate with Kevin on how to get the presentation out after tonight, and looking forward to the discussion. And
sure, yeah. So folks, write down that email address. I think many of you have my email address. So between Judy and me, if you write to one of us, we'll get what you want. Someone asked in the chat, Judy, whether you would make your slides available.
Absolutely.
And, okay. And this presentation will also be available in the cloud. So I can send people the link to that who are interested. So I am going to stop recording at this point. Whoops.
I stopped sharing, and if
You stop.
I'm happy to pull back up slides as people are interested, but I thought I would